This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com. This is the 9th essay in our pro-democracy series. Yes, it's been a long while since the 8th episode, as we've come to find it much easier with how our life is currently structured to output shorter insight episodes in the meantime, as it really takes us 2 to 3 days to write and record a full 5 to 10 or more page essay, and we all know how few of us with jobs, family, etc. get that much free time to ourselves in modernity. And for this, the 9th of at least 25 essays on the subject, and perhaps we can think of this as a slowly written book, with each one essentially being a chapter, we're headed over to not only talking about cults, but nested cults, otherwise known as cults within cults, or one cult that predicates another cult. The word cult itself throughout history has had a neutral connotation. Historically, it has more or less meant a community of worship and or ritual, regardless of what civilization or system that it may have been within. Most early cults were likely neutral, and any member could leave at any time. But over time, the definition has primarily adjusted into a pejorative of being a group which one joins that puts undue influence upon them and is something they can't leave without pain. Since cults have existed on a continuum from healthy ethical influence to unhealthy non-ethical influence, in modernity there are both non-destructive cults but also far too many destructive ones. We've mentioned before that one of the biggest traps that people sink down into when on the spiritual path, and if you're not so into the word spiritual, simply switch it out for growth path or improvement path or development path, is getting into a cult. But what is often the case is that someone is born into a cult, which then has a knock-on effect driving them into getting into a secondary cult, followed by a tertiary cult, etc. And like Matryoshka dolls, otherwise known as Russian dolls, we will be focusing on 3 specific cults nested within one another in this essay. People get brought into a cult thinking they are doing the right thing. For at initial glance, cults can seem to offer a sense of identity, discipline, knowledge, community, or opportunity. Yet once being brought in, destructive cults can use something called the BITE model, which stands for behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions, to manipulate one's mind, heart, and will through thought reform, creating a group with us versus them thinking, where members come to believe that anyone in the group is good and anyone outside of the group is bad. There are levels to cult indoctrination and programming, and the longer one has been in a cult, sadly the deeper they have sunk. When people are deep in a single damaging cult or nested damaging cults, they don't want the truth. They want to live in the illusion of lies of Plato's cave. Because in order to be true, they must transition through the looking glass of realizing that the foundations their supposed truths were built on are actually based on half-truths at best or stacked lies at worst. It's way easier to double down or triple down or quadruple down on their previously inaccurate cult programming, because looking at the foundation of illusions and lies is too painful. Easier to continue to live in echo chambers of more lies. For when one is in a mind control cult, they are not allowed to think independently or critically, and instead must parrot the cult's programming. They must replace their pre-cult impressionable self with a cult identity. One of the most difficult things in the world will-wise, meaning what one decides to do, is for those who have sunk down into groups that discourage individual thoughts and encourage groupthink and use such indoctrination to instead spiritually grow through the steps of admitting that what they've started in is incorrect, negative, wrong, or damaging. They don't want to acknowledge that they've been lied to, manipulated, and exploited. They don't want to be told that they are in a destructive cult or multiple damaging cults which predicate one another, and they don't want to admit that the course correction is needed. They certainly would never want to read or listen to this essay, and they will at times fight to the death to prevent themselves from being unplugged from their false reality. Sadly, a lot of people in a single cult, let alone multiple nested cults, will never be free from them. Leaving is the last thing they ever want to do, and they will ultimately continue their de-evolution. But for those who have the will and development to acknowledge that they have been the fool card from Tarot, those people always need to be talked to with compassion and care. even those who have replaced their old self with a new cult self or never even knew their real non-cult self in the first place. This is the path of life growth, which is hard. As we often say, the human mind is a very complex thing, and one can only work on their own mind for themselves through their heart and will, hopefully with the help of compassion and caring via friends and family. But just like kicking heroin, doing so or removing oneself from a cult can ultimately only primarily be done through the individual's own will. Cult Layer 1, the religious cult. One other definition of cult is a small group of people characterized by heavy devotion. This can exist across all extremes of a political spectrum, as extreme ideologies can certainly be either extreme left or extreme right. The Symbionese Liberation Army, who kidnapped and indoctrinated Patty Hearst in the 1970s, would be an example of a far-left cult. We know someone who got very devoted at first to living for a time at Gilliland's Essetti Ranch. It was a hippie-style commune in rural Washington state, and was probably so left-wing it's right-wing, that claimed to be a hotbed of paranormal activity and frequent UFO sightings. After realizing it was a UFO cult, and not a very large one at that, they and their partner went through severe mental damage and PTSD trying to leave and decouple themselves from the years they spent there. It was very difficult and painful for them. But if you think cults are just small woo-like organizations, think again. Because no one has done cults for such extended periods of time and such large scales as dogmatic, organized big religion, which is extreme male patriarchal hierarchy on steroids. Primarily in the East in the form of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and in the West via primarily Judaism, Catholicism, and Christianity. Can folks be lightly in these systems in a non-destructive, non-pejorative sense of the word? Of course. Is everyone in these systems in a cult in the negative pejorative sense of the word? Of course not. Especially if they keep it primarily personal. We personally are not screaming to the hills with our studies and praxis in our two main spiritual systems, which we find vastly superior to these other systems because they are based in nature and not male authority hierarchy, and instead focus on direct experience over just faith and the improvement of the individual instead of conforming to group ideologies, which are entheogenic shamanism and hermetic alchemy. Short of sharing insights regarding in our films and writings, we keep both primarily personal and light. Many quote-unquote religious people in the world who have the volume turned down into the personal for their faiths, solely using it for their own development, or as community building at a Sunday gathering, or for a light moral framework, are the type of folks who don't get caught in the binary trap of my religion good, other religions bad, but instead want equal opportunity for both women and men, are not hostile to science, are not hostile to evolution, can be sympathetic to all the world's spiritual practices, many of which are within the world's structured faiths, and others are not, and as a result have much less dogma. There are plenty of humane, modest churches that allow their members to have the ability to think critically. Even though still patriarchal and incorrectly thinking God is only one half of the two sexes, these are still superior, more embracing to women and more accepting of gay people churches, and are not destructive to their members and are allowing them to come or go. But it's important for very secular, smart people to realize that a large percentage of the world, and this is definitely true for the United States, are religious in a heavy way from birth. Since the numero uno problem in the world is shit parenting, far too many parents indoctrinate their children into heavy, frenetic religious dogma from birth, with an underlying foundation in a destructive religious cult. This indoctrination into heavy big religion is so strong that someone will spend their whole life not questioning the operating system that has come pre-installed on their mental hard drive. And especially in more rural America, much of Red America grows up with their entire adolescence into adult life with their social lives being based only around their church environment. So if the church is love and light, then fine. But if it's a hate church filled with guilt and shame, then it's a destructive cult that is incredibly painful to try and leave. So to leave the church would require leaving many, if not all, of your friends and family who are also in the cult. Your church is your whole social scene, and is thus the control point for one's social environment. So if one leaves the church, they must leave it all. Easier to just give up on your free will. This is often why well-educated, well-studied in history folks are often secular, because while dogma can exist into science, They have matured to focusing on the fact that morality and being a good person comes primarily from open-minded good parenting that allows children to arrive at what they want in their own time, rather than pre-installing a heavy membership into a religion, which likely comes with so much extra potential baggage. In the book Critical Thinking, An Introduction to Reasoning Well by Jamie Carlin Watson and Robert Arp, it discusses the concept of social conditioning and its impact on people's beliefs and the thinking process, stating, "The overwhelming preponderance of people have not freely decided what to believe, but rather have been socially conditioned, indoctrinated into their beliefs. They are unreflective thinkers. Their minds are the product of social and personal forces they neither understand, control, nor concern themselves with. Their personal beliefs are often based in prejudices. Their thinking consists largely comprised of stereotypes, caricatures, oversimplifications, sweeping generalizations, illusions, delusions, rationalizations, false dogmas, and begged questions. Their motivations are often traceable to irrational fears and attachments, personal vanity and envy, intellectual arrogance, and simple-mindedness. These constructs have become part of their identity, and this is nowhere more true than within heavy religious indoctrination, which is most heavily seen in the United States within the extreme religious loudness of the Christian right, which should be called the Christian wrong, because they don't like or respect other faiths, hate thy gay neighbor instead of love thy gay neighbor, and anyone who isn't a WASP, and protect the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy instead of the bottom. So basically, they just pretend to honor the love-based Christos teachings, but instead do generally the opposite, while promoting Christian nationalism, which is really just Christian supremacy. John Pavlovitz, writer, former non-hate pastor, and activist, said, "I would rather be excluded for the people I included than included for the people I excluded." The Christian wrong is a minority percentage of the population, and although church attendance has been steadily dropping over the decades in the United States, dark imperial hate churches still make up a sizable percentage, at least 25%, in a very religious country slanted and want absolute power within actually less religious freedom. So even though 75% or more of the population are a pro-democracy coalition, regardless of their secular or more moderate to lightly religious stance, this dark minority sector wants an oppressive Handmaid's Tale fascist theocracy. And the way they promote that is through right-wing politics, which protect the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy and lead us into the second cult. Layer 2, the political red cult. We would never in 1,000 years put shamanic or hermetic in the info section of our social media profile, because we don't claim to be a shaman or an alchemist, and also keep it light, and for the most part, outside of what we share in our creative outputs, personal. But when someone puts Christian, conservative, right front and center in their social media profile, you can tell that they are very heavy with it because it's their whole identity. And what they are doing is signaling to other cult members that they are in the same multiple cults. Alchemy is a very evolutionary-based science, which teaches us that most, if not all things in binary reality, meaning the physical world, have on the lower end dysfunction at best or corruption at worst, both physically and mentally. And the purpose of alchemy is to, through a rotary evolutionary process, remove dysfunction. You wouldn't be here as a developing soul if you didn't have problems to work through, with things to improve upon day to day, and one day, shall we say, perfect. And a lazy statement would be to say, politics is corrupt, or all politicians are corrupt. Politics is, in a democracy, messy, yes, and still dysfunctional, yes. But if working on behalf of the middle class, can progress a society through compounding good decisions that work to improve the lives of the proletariat, meaning the working people. So democracy in that regard has value, should result in the progressing and evolving of a civilization, and should always be worked on and improving. But evolution can be painfully slow, and in a country with only 2 real political parties which have a chance of getting into office, there during our lifetime has not been a symmetrical level of corruption between the 2 parties in the United States, but instead one's heavily corrupting influences the other's lesser corruption. While the left in the United States certainly has some corruption, it pales in comparison to the corruption of the right. It is a very asymmetrical comparison. While the problem with Blue America, the Democrats, which we are not a member of but acknowledge they are far less corrupt and dysfunctional than the Republicans, is that at times some of them can be too much like virtually all Republicans, which primarily protect oligarchic wealth and power. Since the American left wing is superior to the American right wing, which is inferior, we're going to spend the rest of this one focusing on continuing right-wing cults. Even after the January 6th domestic terrorist attack, and terrorism is using violence for political influence or gain on the U.S. Capitol after the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful 2020 United States presidential election, some more moderate members of the Republican Party, even though moderates within the party are an endangered species because of our soon-to-be-discussed third cult, who realized it was wrong and a heavy threat to democracy for trying to stage an insurrection, said they would never vote for the opposition party, and instead had to come up with fairy tales of a Fedsurrection, and said they would still vote for the same people who were responsible for said attack. Why? Because they are in a political cult, which would be too painful to mature into leaving because then they have to admit aspects of what they were doing had been wrong the whole time. Cults work from the top down, usually but not always around one leader. The problem with the red part of America, which is led by the GOP, otherwise called the Republicans, is that they are atop of the hierarchy cult, historically being subservient to the robber barons and corporate greed, which is primarily learned through a hierarchy of men cult, being their very staunch religious stances. Not all right-wing people are heavily religious, but the more right-wing someone is, the more likely they are to also be pushing their religion on others. So as said in previous essays in this series, when you are said to be born into sin and spend your whole childhood being taught to be subservient to Sky Daddy and Sky Daddy's son, and being taught to be scared of the red fiery man underground, that hierarchy of men programming, combined with getting power dad downloads from a macho cowboy father figure, makes one much more susceptible to only caring about those at the top of the hierarchy, which are the morbidly rich. So when your policies over the decades have primarily only represented the top 1% of income earners, as Red America's has, and screw everyone else, you have to fib about your intentions. You have to spend decades building a propaganda media machine that spews 24/7 lies with statements like coastal liberal elites, even though over 50% of the US population lives within 50 miles of a coastline, and inflame bullshit cultural wars to get the masses fighting against each other while your robber baron friends rob the people's coffers. And because of top-down cult dogma, being so sure you're right about your stance, the higher up the hierarchy, the better, the lower the worse, in a democratically limited constitutional republic with a constitution which is supposed to represent we the people, meaning all the people, which also include the people in the middle of the hierarchy, and also not just white but also black and brown poor people in the bottom of the hierarchy, you have to turn into ultra-tribal professional liars. See our Insight series regarding the L-curve of income distribution on the subject. And regarding the leading edge of lies, this leads us into the third cult. Layer 3, the conspiracy cult. Now, when someone puts on their social media profile Christian, conservative, hashtag WWG1WGA with multiple American flags, then they are announcing that they are not only in one cult or two cults, but thrice cults. It's turtles of cults all the way down. When we were 12 or 13 years old, we saw Donald Trump in the crap movie Home Alone 2. We would later see him in our late 20s at the US Open in New York City in the early 2000s. All we knew about him when we were a teenager is that he was a slimy schlockmeister businessman who had gaudy gold everything in his NYC penthouse, showed up to classless World Wrestling Federation and plastic Miss USA pageant events, and was the textbook example of everything wrong with corporate America's financial greed. He was also obviously a crap, unloyal, cheating husband who had been married numerous times, as divorce could be said to be very unchristian, by the way. And as we got into our early 20s, it was obvious he was a clear and obvious conman and ignoramus. In our 30s, it became even more obvious that he was just an outright fraud and criminal who ran everything he'd ever been part of into the ground, being the chaos agent and destroyer. Then, into our 40s, we've come to realize that he's a sociopathic, narcissistic, grifting, dog-whistling, gaslighting, bottomless human. Not to mention, at the time of this writing, an adjudicated rapist. And let's not bullshit. Neo-Nazis had been delighted to vote for him, so that tells you everything you need to know about his messaging on civil rights. Although this man takes up way too much of every American's time, at the present time of this writing and speaking, two primary traits about him have become more and more clear to us. The first is that if there's one trait that defines Trump more than any other, it's that he is a liar. It's been fact-checked that he told more than 30,573 misleading or factually inaccurate statements over his term, and those continue every day for the short remainder of his life. He's always been a con man, and with his daddy money has only been able to fail upward through endless lies. So lying is all he knows how to do. So the party of professional liars now has a lie with almost every breath slob as their emperor. While the other trait that defines him is that he is a talented cult leader, spreading a dangerous mental illness to his weak-willed supporters. Knowing what buttons to push and what lies to tell to turn on the ears of those with authoritarian leanings. Trump is the reigning world champion of something in debate called the Gish Gallop, which is a method of outmaneuvering rhetorical opponents with an overwhelming onslaught of dubious arguments. Essentially just talking over someone with a fire hose of rapid lies, which is challenging to respond to because in classical debate you're supposed to respond to each of your opponent's specific arguments with counter-arguments. Even Mark Burnett and other people primarily responsible for creating the garbage reality TV show The Apprentice, which revitalized Trump in the early 2000s, knew he was a fraud back then, but also a talented blabbering gish galloper and thus mental exploiter, thus perfect for trash television. This is probably true in all countries throughout the world, but the worst part of America is we've always had an asshole problem. The least nice, most mean people, who are the liars, extractors, and authoritarians, otherwise known as the assholes, are always trying to gain power. If we look back at history, the Confederate South, who didn't want to transition out of having chattel slavery for Africans, would be an example. The GOP, because of their 40-plus year of Reaganomic golden shower economics that worked to hollow out the middle class, have created an environment where someone like Trump can come into their top-down group not as a cause but as a symptom of America's middle-class financial struggles. Then their members look to all the wrong places for terrible solutions. Rather than focusing on reducing the gap between abject poverty and the tiny sliver of aristocratic morbid wealth from the middle out, the authoritarian cult members' solutions are to look upwards towards the top of the economic hierarchy to a corrupt robber baron who literally named his son Baron after the robber barons and who doesn't give two shits about anyone below him. So the problem that the Republicans now have is there is an authoritarian, anti-democratic loyalty cult of hardcore assholes which have taken over their party, and is purging anyone who's got some remaining shred of decency left from the remainder of that party. Named the MAGA cult, which stands secondarily for Make Attorneys Get Attorneys, which will get into the importance of the natural guardrails of democracy, the courts, later in this series, but primarily stands for Manipulating America's Gullible Assholes. It's a non-original, stale fart rehash of Ronald Wilson Reagan's 6 letters campaign slogan from the 80s, and make no mistake, is a fascist cancer now embedded into the party. So when you're not in a wrong-wing authoritarian cult, let alone multiple wrong-wing nested authoritarian cults, all of these accurate traits about Trump we stated earlier, and could already be seen when we were still a kid, are obvious. But when one is in these cults, they think 180 degrees the opposite. They think he's handpicked by fictional white Republican Jesus for the highest office in the land. Trump or not, they will continue to always think the worst person for the job is the best, and the best person for the job is the worst. Everything is mirrored back to front, because fascism, through all of history, has only been able to exist within an endless soup of lies stacked upon lies, from cults within cults. Frederick Clarkson writes in his book Eternal Hostility, The Struggle Between Theocracy and Democracy, that it would only be a matter of time where such a top-down party would allow such a type of person to infect it. The GOP has now transmuted from heavy corruption to near full corruption, becoming the GQP, with theocracy nested in regressive backwards politics nested in shadow conspiracy, resulting in a 5-alarm clown show dumpster fire that can't tell the truth, let alone legislate on behalf of we the people because it's infected with MAGA and QAnon. A far-right conspiracy theory that alleges a secret plot against Donald Trump by a deep state of government officials, celebrities, and other prominent figures. And my apologies for having to bring down this podcast by even mentioning it. The theory is based on cryptic messages posted online by an anonymous user or group of users known as Q. These messages, which started appearing on forums in the toilet sewers of the internet, 4chan and 8chan in 2017, and have been consistently incorrect in their forecasting, often predicted future events or claim to have insider knowledge on government operations. QAnon followers believed, and remember, believe has lie in the middle of the word, that Trump was waging a secret war against this supposed deep state, which they believed is involved in various nefarious activities, including child trafficking, Satan worship, and attempting to undermine their Orange Hut emperor. Because it's a loyalty cult to primarily Trump, but also Putin and other wannabe dictators, with no room for questions or criticism of said malignant narcissistic cult leaders who are said to never do any wrong. We are 50-50 on conspiracy. Having been a guest on what is likely one of the world's top conspiracy podcasts called the Higher Side Chats, related to a past project, we will absolutely acknowledge that the world is not how you initially were taught it to be. And thus some conspiracies are accurate, such as countries doing what's called false flags as pretexts for war. But the 10,000 foot is that a conspiracy is accurate if it's on behalf of the oligarchs, and not accurate if it's not helping the oligarchs. The thing about conspiracy that boggles the mind is the accurate identification of problems that, yes, there are secret things going on behind the scenes, followed immediately by batshit crazy solutions being proposed to such problems. A conspiracy theory claiming such a bottomless human being who became a TV show con man is the savior of the Republic is so dumb it's mind-boggling. Yet the deeper one goes into it, the darker it gets, being a closed authoritarian loop where truth doesn't matter. Only a dark imperial theocracy with a deep capacity to hate, with anything not from their MAGA ideology being said to be deep state fake news, which is textbook cult programming, being a hall of mirrors to grow misinformation and rocket fuel for inciting violence. Thrice cultist Qs have literally called for the executions of their opponents, which literally sound like they're from the First Crusade from nearly 1,000 years ago. In 2020, the FBI, which is very much an imperfect organization, yes, identified QAnon as a domestic stochastic terrorism threat, citing the theory's ability to radicalize individuals and consistent inspiring of violent incidences. Watching people we've known from the alternative media sphere or even some past acquaintances, friends, and colleagues get sucked down into the QAnon Joker spiral has been deeply disappointing to us. We have a friend, a woman, who was literally engaged to a guy who then wisely broke off the engagement because she came to find out her fiancé was a QAnon lunatic. We have another friend, a man, who hasn't spoken to his kooky sister in the better part of 10 years because she's so deep in the cult. The subreddit QAnon Casualties contains story after story after story of families separated or destroyed because of souls lost to QAnon, in which people share their pain and suffering caused by friends and family who have had their pre-cult selves replaced with cult selves in the cancer's cultist mutation, some of which will leave the cult, but many of which sadly will never return. We understandably do not waste time on someone so deep in thrice cults that we know they have been hollowed. So we can instead focus on those on the veil or returning from the event horizon of the black hole of cults and away from the toxicity to come back up into the realm of critical thinking. We've also called it a death cult because, like Milton William Cooper, a ufologist and conspiracist who wrote the book Behold a Pale Horse, which we have read and became one of the conspiracy Bibles, who chose to clock out via harrowing shootout with the sheriff's department rather than just pay his federal taxes, some members of the cult will continue to go to jail for QAnon lies or even win the Ashley Babbitt Award and die on behalf of QAnon. Jim Jones cult clockout style. While QAnon and MAGA both deserve zero respect, to give some credit to more moderate conservatives, which do deserve respect, many of which have in fact switched to become independents, there are still members of the Republican Party who are only in Cult 1 and Cult 2 but not in Cult 3 and have spoken out against Cult 3. While many members of the party are too cowardly to publicly speak out against cult number 3 at all, it must be understood that the pro-democracy movement is not as much a liberal versus conservative issue, but more a pro-democracy versus authoritarianism issue. And those on the front lines, which are those within Red America, whose party is the primary threat to democracy, must either reform it or leave it. Just like the Christians in name only that hide within Christianity, many authoritarians who hate democracy hide within conservatism. But that certainly doesn't mean all conservatives are not pro-democracy. Because MAGA, to be honest, could be said to not even be conservative. Instead, it's mainly just fascism mixed with idiocracy, who don't like Americans not in their cult voting.